So here we are at their stories. Oh, excuse me. At their stories, our voices, at our Sharing Their Stories Partisan Stories event. As you heard, we have our facilitator, our scholar Lynne Feldman, who is also a storyteller today, as is Joanne Gilbert and Dena Hirsch. So our first storyteller we get to hear right away is Joanne Gilbert telling the story of Manya Barman. I'm going to stop the screen and I'm going to officially introduce her. Joanne Gilbert is committed to celebrating the indomitable women whose true stories prove that Jews in the Holocaust fought back. One of those women was the late Manya Barman Feldman, who was born into a middle-class Orthodox Jewish family in 1923 in Dobrowica, Poland, not far from the border of the USSR. In August 1939, this small town came under the control of the Soviets, and then in June 1941, the Germans. After Manya escaped the ghetto with her father, her brother, and sister, she joined the notoriously fierce Soviet Kovpak partisans in the forest. After liberation, she married another survivor, and they made their way to the USA, where they began their family. Manya had a long career as a Hebrew teacher. So we're going to hear from Joanne. I am going to spotlight Joanne. And take your time. Whenever you're ready to start, we are ready to listen.
Thank you. It was a brutally cold winter, and our Soviet partisan group, the fierce Kovpaks, had been slogging through the snowy forest for several months, never staying in one place more than a couple of days. It wasn't unusual to find people who had frozen to death on our path. When I wasn't cooking, repairing weapons, making explosives, or going on a raid to steal food, weapons, and medicines, I was bandaging up injured partisans and nursing others who were suffering terribly with typhus. I knew all too well how contagious it was, so I wasn't at all surprised when I also became very sick. So during that time, I was either freezing cold or burning up with high fever. From my toes to my head, everything hurt, and I could barely move or even stay awake. It was strange in all of that misery, however, I was a bit lucky. I was lucky it got me when it did, because we'd unexpectedly had to stop for a full month. So at least I didn't have to be on the run while I was sick. The reason we had to stop wasn't so lucky. It was because we had accumulated so many sick and wounded people. There were just too many to take with us and too many to leave behind. Making our situation even worse, we were running out of ammunition, out of dynamite, out of medications, and it was harder and harder to scavenge the area for food under the snow. On the bright side, our camp was situated next to a huge, very deep lake, and it was frozen solid. So our leaders decided we should make an airfield right there on the ice. We had radio contact with our superiors in Moscow, and they were able to send us squads of small planes every night, somehow landing on the ice in the dark, skimming over the treetops around the edge with their lights and their noisy engines turned off. They just glided in through the darkness, guided by our flickering torches and somehow only by our flickering cigarette lighters. They brought us ammunition, medications, matches, food, blankets, clothing, and most importantly, they would replenish our supply of heavy, warm boots. This was so important because if our feet got wet, if our feet froze, we would get gangrene. And very likely we would end up being permanently crippled or would lose our feet. So as soon as we unloaded their supplies, we would reload the little planes with our wounded and our sick. Sometimes we could smush in 4 to 5 of our partisans into each of those little planes. Well, everything happened so fast. The pilots and their special cargo had to be in and out as quick as possible because the surrounding peasants were so eager to spot them and report to the Germans and gather their own rewards for denouncing us. So my comrades and I slid around helter-skelter on the ice, unloading and reloading as quietly as possible. Everyone was silently slipping and falling. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so frightening. We couldn't scream, we couldn't laugh, we couldn't even call for help if we'd fallen and broken a bone. Can you imagine all of this crazy activity silently going on night after night in the winter, in the middle of a frozen forest for a whole month? Well, in the midst of this, I got more and more sick and finally wasn't even able to move. My comrades packed up some food and blankets and took me to an empty safe house in a neighboring village. They hoped I'd recover. We both hoped that I'd be able to rejoin them. I had lain there alone for a couple of days. I have no idea. When our leader came to tell me that finally the group was leaving. And as I lay there immobilized, he ordered me to get up and join them or be left behind. We both knew that if the Germans found me, I'd be raped, I'd be tortured to give up information about the partisans, and then I'd be killed. I told him just to go ahead without me. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't thinking about being raped, tortured, or killed because I figured I'd be dead by the time the Germans came. And so we waved goodbye, sadly. Again, on the bright side, what I hadn't known at the time was that there was a very young Polish couple who lived nearby and had been watching this safe house. And they had realized that when the partisans moved on, they had left a sick girl behind. For some reason, they decided to help me. Maybe it was because we were about the same age, late teenage years. So they brought their horse and cart over to the safe house, and they told me that they were going to take me to safety. What did I know? They knew I was in great pain, and they tried to be gentle as they hoisted me up and shoved me into the cart and then covered me with hay and rocks and dirt and I don't know what else. And then they took me to a local farmer's house. He had been persuaded to take and protect me. In fact, the young man of the couple told the farmer that I was a Kovpak partisan and warned him that if anything bad happened to me, that my comrades would swoop down and kill the farmer and his family. The young man said he and his wife would be back in a few days to pick me up. But he didn't come back. So the farmer was stuck with me, and I was stuck with him. Sometime later, I found out that the young couple had only managed to go a few miles before the Germans found and killed them both. This young, beautiful couple with their lives all ahead of them had died because they'd helped me. Well, the farmer knew that the Germans were coming closer every day. And so he knew of a group of Jews who were hiding in a house not far away. And he contacted them to come and get me. He said, I've got one of your own, and she needs to come with you. I was overjoyed to be in the company of Jews, to be able to hear Yiddish and speak it and share stories and gossip. But I didn't have much time to be comfortable and safe, because they decided that they were going to flee to the forest that very night. Of course, they asked if I wanted to come along, but I was still too sick to run. So I said, no, go without me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm cold or I'm hot. I need to sleep. I can't move. Go and be safe. Now, in the middle of the room, there was what we called a Russian oven. It was freestanding and it was open all around. On one side, it faced what would be the kitchen, and there you could make a fire for cooking. On the other side, which was more like the parlor, there was a long ledge where people could sit if they didn't mind the ashes. Or if, like me, they needed to sleep, they could stretch out and sleep on the ledge. And that's exactly what I did. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by the unmistakable, loud, hatchet-sharp sounds of German men. They were clomping into the house and shaking the snow off of their boots. They were surprised to see a young girl sitting on the hearth, and they immediately pointed their rifles close to my face as if I were the dangerous one. They demanded in German that I identified myself, but I knew I'd be better off if they didn't know that I understood German. So I pretended not to understand, and I kept holding my head and repeating, I'm a Polish girl, I'm a Polish girl, I'm sick, I need to go to sleep. And naturally, they thought I was crazy. Well, I continued to pretend that I didn't know what they were talking about, and it was almost comical to watch them try to communicate with me, these big, tough, uniformed German soldiers. Then they tried to use hand gestures, pantomiming that they would be staying in the house. So like a German soldier with a rifle, pantomiming that they would be sleeping overnight in the house. And they went on to the kitchen side of the Russian oven, and they unloaded their packs with things I never thought I would see again. Breads, onions, canned milk, cheeses, tea, coffee, butter, fresh eggs, and even cookies. I knew when I saw all that I must be delirious. After a little more back and forth, I pretended to finally understand that they wanted me to make them dinner. So I found a big frying pan and dropped a big chunk of butter into it. And then I chopped and added the onions, and the aroma from the sizzling, buttery, crisping onions was overwhelming. I made scrambled eggs for them, sneaking only a few delicious mouthfuls in the process. I figured I was entitled to have some food before they killed me. I found plates and flatware, set the table, and then motioned for them to come and eat. And when they were seated at the table, they looked at me. My heart stood still, and then they motioned for me to come join them. One of them even stood up and pulled back a chair for me, like I was a lady. So I sat and ate with Germans, as if we were all at a restaurant, maybe celebrating a birthday. And they shared everything they had with me. Ask, eat a little, have more, have some of this. I had to be careful not to overload my starved digestive system, or I would get violently ill. So I did. I ate a little here, I ate a little there. And you know what was funny? In the entire time they were talking, not once did anyone mention raping, torturing, or killing me. So I was confused. After dinner, I cleaned up and went back to my ledge and fell asleep. When I woke up, the house was strangely quiet, as if the quiet had a power of its own. I crept around and there were no Germans anywhere in the house. There wasn't a scrap, there wasn't a crumb. There was no evidence that they had been there. And in my condition, I figured I'd made the whole thing up. I walked outside. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of sparkling snow. It was a frozen ghost town. I dashed back in the house and searched to see if I could find anything that would be useful to me in the forest or that I could trade for something I needed. So I found a mangy old toothbrush, a hard stale chunk of bread, even an old dusty jar of jam and back in the corner of a cupboard. I also found salt and matches, all of which I put in my pockets. I found a raggedy, smelly old blanket, which I draped over my head and then wrapped around me. I was leaving that house and I was leaving that village. And as I walked out of town, I slowly looked behind me and saw cats and dogs and chickens and goats and even some cows roaming through the snowy streets, hungrily searching for food. The forest was about 500 meters ahead of me, and I calmly and determinedly walked toward it to rejoin my partisans, one foot in front of the other, sometimes falling, sometimes crawling, always getting up, keeping my head down on that long, icy, snowy road, hoping I wouldn't fall and not be able to get up and freeze to death. Suddenly, I heard yelling ahead of me, so I looked up and saw some farmers and a horse and a cart gesturing, waving, and shouting, "What's going on in the village?" I didn't know what was going on in the village, so I said, "I don't know what's going on." And then I turned around to see, and the entire village was in flames. I was lucky. I'd gotten out just in time. It seemed like hours later when I was so tired I could barely walk, and I saw a farmhouse with smoke coming out of the chimney. I trudged toward it, hoping they would give me some food and shelter. I fell just as I approached the door, and on the way down, I spied through the window that there was a dining table with big men sitting around it, eating, of all things, pancakes. I reached up and knocked as hard as I could on the door. My stomach was growling. And a very large, very angry, red-faced man opened the door and demanded to know what I wanted, looking down on me. I could see his fury. I looked up and asked, could you please give me something to eat and let me get warm? Unlike the Germans who thought I'd been a Polish girl, this guy somehow knew I was a Jewish girl. He started kicking me and yelling, "Get out of here, you dirty Jew." I managed to shrink back, get up, turn, and walk back toward the forest and back toward my partisans. Days later, when I met up with some others in the forest, I learned that soon after I'd been so cruelly ordered away from the farmhouse, that this same group of Germans had come, tied up the men, taken their food, taken their beer, taken their blankets, then barricaded the door and set the farmhouse on fire. If I hadn't been such a dirty Jew, I would have been burned alive with those brutal, brutal men. Thank you. Here we have Manya. After liberation, she and her husband were living in Berlin. He worked on the black market and made enough money to get them to Detroit, Michigan. And on the right, Manya and I had just made a presentation in Detroit, and you can see how happy we were. We're holding hands when they take the picture.
Joanne, thank you so much for your beautiful telling and for Manya's story. Jennifer. Okay, we are going to start touching a bit on the history. So, partisans. Let's start with a small definition. What are partisans, or what are Jewish partisans? So partisans in general, according to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, were armed resistance, not organized as a military, that basically create sabotage against the Germans and other oppressors. Jewish partisans were anywhere where the Reich took over. So as we can see from this map, this isn't a full list of all the places where we have partisans, but these are kind of the outstanding ones, or the larger partisan groups. And we'll just mention a few of them. We have some in Lublin, in Krakow, in Vilna, Grodno, and as you can see, many, many different places. Altogether, there were about 30,000 Jewish partisans who fought in the ex-Soviet territories, and about 25,000 in the rest of occupied Europe. Jennifer, can we move one slide, please? One of the main things that the partisan groups would do was sabotage, sabotaging train tracks, carrying usually German soldiers, German arms, any Nazi kind of convoy that would go through. And we have here a couple of photos of the Slovak partisans sabotaging train tracks. So we can actually see the dynamite being put under the train tracks, and then the result of that dynamite, which is, as we can see, a derailed train. Could we move one more slide, please? So we are just going to touch very slightly on different partisans from different countries. So the photo that we have in front of us are Jewish partisans from Kapinisi in Greece. The Greek partisans were a bit different to, let's say, Central European partisans. A lot of the fighting happens in mountains, in mountain areas, and in different islands, because Greece, of course, is not just one place, but it is spread on different small islands, and anywhere within those islands, there were Greek partisans, and in different groups of these Greek partisans, we do have Jews who join in. Greece, the situation in Greece is very different to the rest of Europe. It is more like the Germans come in and deportations begin quite quickly. So whoever manages to go out and fight, that is what they do. If we could move one more slide, please. And we're going to stop for a bit and talk about the Yugoslavian partisans, because Yugoslavia has a very unique situation in Europe when it comes to partisans. And I think we can even bring down the slides.
Then they're down.
Thank you. Okay, so Yugoslavia has Tito as the head of the Yugoslavian Communist Party. He joins the party quite early and becomes the leader, and in 1937, he creates a movement, not just a political party, but actually a movement. And when Yugoslavia is invaded by the Germans, this whole movement, this whole communist gathering of people create the partisans. That's what they call themselves, the partisans. They didn't give themselves any kind of fancy schmancy name, but they were the partisans. And they start forms of resistance against their occupiers. When Operation Barbarossa starts, this is June of 1941, the Yugoslavian underground starts to basically fight like an army. So they're not part of the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, but they're fighting in groups, in units. They have a command, and they also, wherever they can, start liberating areas. The biggest operation that I want to talk about today, because there's a lot we can say about the Yugoslavian partisans, but I'm going to focus just on one, was when the Germans are starting to move towards Italy. Italian soldiers flee out of their military camps. They're basically run away, they escape. The partisan movement, Tito's partisan movement, goes into those military camps, steals whatever they can, guns, bullets, grenade, whatever they could put their hands on. They steal all this ammunition and start using it. But as they're progressing with their leaving these military camps, the fleeing Italian soldiers realize that they can go into this kind of guerrilla fighting. And the Italian soldiers join within the ranks of the partisans of Tito. So this is something very unique. We don't see a lot of this in partisan movements. Just to give us kind of a general number, we're talking about, by 1943, over 250,000 partisans are part of Tito's partisan movement. That is an incredible and astounding number. But where are the Jews, do you ask? Yes, the Jews join this partisan movement as well, but they are considered like any other partisan. In many cases, and we'll talk about this a bit later, we see that there is a different kind of attitude towards the Jews that join non-Jewish partisan groups. In Yugoslavia, they don't care. You're Jewish, you're Christian, you're whatever, you're Italian, everything is fine, as long as you're fighting together. By the end of 1943, we see that the partisan movement has basically cleared out many different areas, including liberating one very, very small, can't really call it a ghetto, but a concentration of Jews, and those Jews join into the partisan ranks as well. We have about 4,500 Jews altogether within the Yugoslavian partisan movement, out of which by the end of the war, about 720 were killed in action, actually fighting the Germans, which is an astounding thing as well, I believe. So let us continue and come back to the slides for a moment, please. And we'll move one slide. Oh, so just that photo of those partisans, if we can move back one. I just want to mention that we usually know if the people in the photos are Jews or non-Jews when we have archival footage of these partisans. In this specific photo, we just know them as Yugoslavian partisans. I cannot tell you what religion any of these people are. They are just part of that movement, which again is a really unique situation for Yugoslavia. So let's move to the next one. And this is just a sample for yet another group of partisans in Czechoslovakia. Again, like in Greece, we see here a lot of the fighting happens actually in the mountains and not so much in forests or in plain land. And here we see the combination of the two. This group of partisans are in a forest, but up in the mountains. in heavy snow. This specific photo is not of Jewish partisans. It is just the partisan movement coming up to their headquarters up in the mountains. We do know that there were Jews that joined the Yugoslavian partisan movement, but we don't have any footage that points exactly to this. So if we could move one more. And I'm sorry I'm rushing, it's just that we have such good stories today that I'd rather we heard more stories than just talk history, which is important, of course, but not enough. Okay, so we're going to spend a few minutes discussing Poland. Polish partisan movements are split into two. We have the nationalist partisans, Polish nationalists, and we have the communist partisan movement. So, quick history: Poland is occupied from the 1st of September 1939, when the war begins. The Polish army has to surrender by the 17th of, well, it doesn't have to, but that's what happens. Polish army surrenders by the 17th of September 1939. The government goes to exile into London, and most of the Polish military is dismantled. But is it really? No, they split into partisan movements. They move into kind of guerrilla fighting. On the 20th of September, part of Poland is taken over by the Soviet Union, the USSR. Poland ceases to exist, but their people, they still are resisting. So we have two different groups. We have the Armia Krajowa and Armia Ludowa. The Krajowa one is our nationalist group. They are Polish nationalists. They are fighting for Poland. They're not fighting for any greater goal. And their nationalism affects also how they treat the Jewish partisans and the Jewish underground, even before there is a Jewish partisan movement in Poland. How do we see this? So, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there is a mini uprising in January of 1943, which fails. And then there is the Great Uprising, which is in April, 19th of April, 1943. Leading up towards the uprising and leading towards the liquidation of the ghetto, the underground movements within the ghetto are trying to buy arms, buy ammunition, get some training, whoever needed it, and so on. Armia Krajowa does not want to work with the Jewish underground. Most of the members in this partisan group have anti-Semitic sentiments even pre-war. During the war, that we don't see much of a change in this. But I mentioned before that the Polish government goes to exile in London. The Jewish resistance movement contacts through underground channels the exiled, the government in exile, and they say, we need help. We have heard rumors that our ghetto is going to be liquidated, and we are planning a revolt. So the government sends down an order to Armia Krajowa and say, you need to help the Jewish resistance. This is also going to help the Polish resistance. And after oohing and eyeing and eyeing and oohing, they decide, okay, the government told us to do this, we'll do this. And they give 10 guns. 10 guns. It doesn't do very much. Not when in the ghetto we have over 60,000 people who are trying to fight for not being sent off to concentration camps. On the other hand, Armia Ludowa is a communist group of partisans who identify a lot with communist ideals and make their connections with the Red Army and with the government in the Soviet Union. And they are much more willing to allow cooperation with the Jewish partisans, to the extent that after the uprising in Warsaw Ghetto, Jews who wanted to join partisan movements actually join Armia Ludowa, and go and fight in the Polish woods as well. We find that the attitude, though it is not the best towards the Jews, they're still accepted. They still become part of this partisan movement. And as part of that movement, they get to fight, they get to use arms, and they get to resist the Germans. So this is a small sample of how different groups of partisans react to the Jews who try to join their ranks. Let's move on. Now, we also have another kind of partisan movement, and that is what we call family camps. There are two known family camps in occupied Europe. And the first one we're going to hear a very short explanation about is the Zorin family camp. So the Zorin family camp was founded in the forest near Minsk. So we're talking in what was the Soviet territories at the time. Shlomo Zorin, who was a Jew, up until 1941, went through the war like many of the Jews in the Soviet territories under the Soviet occupation. But from the beginning of the Operation Barbarossa, June of 1941, the Germans come in, and in Minsk, a ghetto is formed. Zorin and his whole family, like many of the other Jews, were sent into the ghetto. In the meantime, there's also killing happening in killing pits. Zorin meets a Soviet officer who was fleeing from Minsk when the Germans come in, and makes contact with him. And the two of them have a conversation about escaping to the forests. And Zorin says, I want my whole family to come with me. And again, here we see a lot of oohing and ahhing. What are we going to do with older people? What are we going to do with children? And to start off with, it is only the Zorin family itself that leaves, or escapes more like, the Minsk ghetto together with this fleeing Soviet soldier, I should say. He wasn't an officer. So this is about 19 miles away from Minsk, not very close. And as they're sitting in the forest, Shlomo Zorin keeps saying, there's still so many people in the ghetto. We need to get them out of the ghetto. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion, but at the end, it is decided, okay, we're gonna go and get Jews out of the ghetto. And they do. And they start off with about 100 who leave the ghetto and come and join the Zorin family. After these 100 people come, Shlomo decides it's not enough that we're bringing Jews out of the ghetto. We actually need to join partisans. We've heard there are partisans in this forest somewhere, and we need to join them. We need to fight the Germans. He manages, together with this Soviet soldier, to find the partisan unit. And he brings the case of, we have able Jewish men here and women, and we want to fight. And after a lot of deliberation and communication between the heads of that Soviet partisan movement, they contact Moscow. Moscow says, okay, let them create a unit. We will oversee them. And Unit 106, that's what they were called, was created. And Zorin realizes that the 100 people that he has in the forest is really not enough, because not all of them can fight. So they go back to the ghetto and they start getting more and more people. And at the beginning, his Unit 106 had 60 men and 15 guns. By the time of liberation, there are 800 people in the Zorin camps and many, many more guns. And they do lots of acts of sabotage around the Minsk area and even further away. In July of 1944, Shlomo Zorin himself gets wounded in battle with the Germans in the forest. He gets injured, he gets shot in his leg, but survives. And just to finish off Shlomo Zorin's story, in 1971, the whole Zorin family comes to live in Israel. They all survived together with, not together coming to Israel, but together with the Zorin family, all 800 people who were brought to the forest survive. So that's a little fascinating form of resistance and partisans, where we also have people who did not go out fighting, but still stayed in the forest. Can we move one slide? But how do we live in the forest? This is something that I'm always asked, you know, what do you do? How do you survive living in the forest? One of the things that the partisans came up with, and this is not specific to family camps, this is partisans all over occupied Europe in the forests, different situation in the mountains, is building something that is called Zimlanka, which is a Russian word for little hut, I believe, but my Russian isn't great, so I might have been told the wrong translation. So a Zimlanka is built half underground, half above ground, where the roof is always covered with shrubbery and greenery and twigs and leaves and whatever to make it look as if it's part of the forest ground. Some Zimlankas were small, like the little one that we can see on the, I don't know if that's your right or my right or whatever, the smaller one that doesn't look so much like a house. And that would house about 2 to 4 people. And then we have larger ones, like the one that actually looks like a little entrance to a house and has 2 benches, that could hold 10, 12, 15 people. So the last time we did this program, one of the questions that came up, but I'm going to say it now anyway, is, but how do you fit so many people in? Well, you sleep in shifts. Not everybody sleeps together at the same time. You also need to keep guard and make sure that nobody sees you and that nobody comes close to your campsite. Family camps created also other kind of living spaces, like we can see in this photo with the benches and kitchens and hospitals and schools and anything else we can think about that we would need for life in general. So not to say that this was an easy life, it was difficult, but it was a form of survival. So if we could move one more, please. And the second family camp, which is probably the more famous one, is the Bielski family camp, which had a Hollywood movie created around the Bielskis. So the Bielskis were 3 brothers, Tuvia, Asael, and Zeus. They were 3 out of 12, I should say. This isn't the whole Bielski family. These are 3 brothers out of 12. And they came from a very small village near Novogrodic. Novogrodic is in today Belarus, and then it was under Soviet rule. And again, from June 1941, we have the Nazis progressing and taking over more and more areas. And one of the areas was Novogrodic, where they opened a small ghetto, which was actually in a factory. Pardon me. And the 3 Bielski brothers decide that they are not going to be spending their time in a ghetto. They want to go out and fight. And they want to go and look for the partisan units in the Novogrodic forest. So they do this. They actually go out. And Tuvia, who was the oldest brother, he was 35 when he goes out to the forest. He came with military experience. He served in the Russian Red Army, so he knew how to use a gun. He knew how to be a soldier. So all 3 of them go out, and the brothers all decide that they need to start bringing in more Jews so that they can actually have Jewish resistance and not just the Soviet resistance that already existed in that forest. And just like we saw in the Zorin family, they keep going back to the ghetto and they keep bringing in more, but also people hear about this, Jews hear about this. There's a thing, the Jewish silent network, that people hear things from different places, and not everybody that shows up at the Bielski family camp is actually from Novogrodic. Some come from Pinsk, some come from other places. And by the spring of 1942, they already have almost 100 able men and women, and they can create now a fighting partisan movement, which is what they do. They do join the local Soviet group. Again, they fight as a Jewish unit within the larger partisan movement. And by 1943, there's already over 1,000 people in the Novogrodic forest in the Bielski family camp. And what do they do? Exactly what we saw with the Zorins, only even more elevated, because the Bielski family camp becomes the center that takes care of food and clothing and any kind of medical service for all the partisans in the area. So these are also the Soviet partisans and also other nationalities that managed to make their way into these forests. They also opened a school in the forest. This is the only school we actually know about today. I always have to say that when I say things in numbers and whatever, as a historian, I have to mention that this is what we know today. In 10 years from now, we might know much more, but today we know this is the only school that was opened, and this is because we had so many children who were brought into this camp and also born in the woods. Although this is contention between the Bielski brothers on whether or not to allow people to get married and have children in the forest, but they did because people are people. They also manage the Bielski unit also manages to contact the Polish government in exile and ask them for more help and for ammunition from their communist partisans, and there is collaboration between the two. In July of 1944, the Red Army manages to liberate most of what is today Belarusia, together with the Bielskis. 1,140 Jews from this partisan unit are liberated, so to speak. They have staggering good numbers. This Jewish partisan group, they managed to kill 381 Nazis. Just a little number to throw out there. The surviving members of the group spread all over the place, so I'm not going to start mentioning. I will say that the three Bielski brothers moved to the States, and the Bielski family camp has many events and things that happen, and if you look them up in the internet, you'll find that they have reunions and their children and their children's children's now, so it's a whole big thing. And let's move on. Talking of which.
Yes, thank you, Lynn, for this incredible knowledge. And so now it is time for another story. We're going to be hearing from Dena Hirsch. She will be telling the story of her father, Litman Litowerski. I'm going to take down the look at this for a moment. You'll see why soon. Both of Dena's parents were members of the Jewish resistance, while Litman survived the war with 3 of his siblings and a number of cousins. Dena's mother, Zelda, was the sole survivor of a family of 72 people. Dena, I'm going to spotlight you and take your time.
Thank you, Jennifer. On that cover to Harold Warner's book, Fighting Back, there's one person who stands out in my mind. He was kneeling on the bottom left, staring down the barrel of his rifle at me, or perhaps at one of you. That man was Litman Litowerski, and he would survive the Holocaust and become my father. The photograph was actually taken by an Allied pilot who was delivering weapons to the partisans. Every time I look at that picture, I have to shake my head, because the man I knew as my father for the first 61 years of my life was a kind and gentle man who could turn anyone he met into a friend. With his beautiful voice and his thorough knowledge of Hebrew prayers, he served as the unofficial cantor of our small synagogue in Salisbury, Maryland. He was president of the synagogue, principal of the religious school, and yes, one teacher did threaten to send me to the principal and then remembered who he was. He started the adult education program and the Holocaust commemoration. He was a one-man sunshine committee. He showed up at the local hospital so often that the staff there, he was clergy and gave him a clergy pass. He was one of 9 children born to Moshe Zev and Deborah Litowerski. 2 of his older siblings died while they were quite young. 3 of them and his father were murdered by the Nazis. But his 2 older sisters and a younger brother were able to survive with him as partisans. In spite of all my father's experiences, he maintained his strong belief in our God until he died at age 90. I asked him once how, in light of what he experienced during the Holocaust, what he saw and what he lost, how could he still believe so strongly in our God? And his response was, "It's hard to live with a God like this, but it's even harder to live without him." Now, I have to admit that although I had a very good Jewish upbringing, spent a lot of time in synagogue, when I grew older and I learned more about the Holocaust, and specifically my parents' experiences in it, I found it increasingly difficult to believe in this God the way my dad did. But I'm still working on it. So how did this farmer from a religious family become a partisan? In the summer of 1942, Dad, his 2 sisters and brother, a couple of cousins, and a future brother-in-law were working on a collective farm that the Polish farmers were running. And he was hoping that in the fall, the rest of his family, who were still living in Maychek, which was the neighboring town, would be called to help with the harvest. But that never happened. And my father decided that rather than growing things to benefit the Germans, he wanted to fight them. And he prepared an escape plan. Before he executed it, however, he sent a message to Label Gilerovich, who was my mother's oldest brother and a leader of the Jewish community in Maychek, and he explained his plan. And he received a rather stern message back from Label, who said to him, "You do not have the right to shorten the life of even a single Jew, not for months, not for weeks, days, or even hours." And my father understood that he was referring to the fact that if Jews escaped, and it was known that they escaped, that all the Jews in a neighboring town could be murdered. And so he put his plan on hold. But the Germans had other plans. And shortly thereafter, they set fire to Maychek, and they took the remaining Jews, gathered them in front of a mass grave, and murdered them. When my father saw the flames and heard the machine gun fire, he knew what was happening. And he knew there was no longer a reason to delay their escape into the forest. In anticipation of this day, they had amassed a small arsenal of weapons: 1 rifle, 50 bullets, 2 hand grenades, and a bayonet. It was Dad's friend Munyak, who was the son of the local Catholic priest, who obtained these weapons for him. In exchange, he received a good suit of clothes. Now, my father had never shot a gun before. Fortunately, the man who would become his brother-in-law had served in the Polish army for 2 years, and he had the requisite skills. Eventually, they obtained more weapons, some by bartering and some by more persuasive methods. Eventually, they learned how to make bombs out of unexploded artillery shells. And they started out, they would cut telephone wires and maybe uncouple railroad tracks. And soon they graduated to bombing bridges and trains. My father said that he and his group became partisans as a way of choosing their own way of dying. They never thought in 1,000 years that they would survive, but they thought that along the way, they would avenge the blood of their family, their friends, their Jewish brothers and sisters. The first time my father killed someone, he said he thought he would lose his mind. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, but he did what he had to do. And eventually he became so well known as a partisan leader that the Nazis put a price of $2,600, the equivalent of $2,600 on his head. And my father would joke, if I'd known my head was so valuable, I would have taken better care of it. Among the tasks that the partisans engaged upon was dealing with people who would turn in Jews for the bounty they would receive. That bounty was 4 pounds of salt and 2 packages of tobacco. That was the value of a Jewish life. Another task was dealing with those people who turned in those Jewish brothers and sisters. Dealing often meant killing. Dad knew the 6th commandment, certainly, thou shalt not murder. But he also knew from his study of the Talmud that the rabbis said, if a man rises to kill you, you rise and kill him first. One particular story of my dad's exploits stands out in my mind. At this point, they were part of the Bielski partisans, about whom Lynne just spoke. And at this time, my mother had joined their group. Dad's group was returning from one of their missions. And they decided, because it was so late at night and dark, that they would spend the night in the barn of a sympathetic Polish farmer. They lay there in their clothes with their weapons between their legs, and early in the morning, the farmer came rushing in and said, you have to leave. There are German and Ukrainian soldiers everywhere. So the men jumped out of the rear window, started making their way across the field towards the forest when they were discovered by the soldiers, who launched artillery and machine gun fire at them. Dad would later learn that there was a force of 1,800 soldiers in the area seeking out partisan groups. He told his men to lie down in the field, but still their weapons were nothing compared to the soldiers. And he watched as one by one they were killed. And he felt some water, what he thought was water in his boot. And he looked down and he saw that he was bleeding heavily from a piece of shrapnel embedded in his side. Now, one of the partisans' greatest fears was being captured alive. And so they were each instructed to carry a personal weapon with them, a handgun, and to leave 2 bullets in case they needed to use it on themselves. So Dad took out his handgun. It was a Russian handgun, and it had a a bulky, difficult trigger, and he put it up to his head. But he was so weak from the blood loss that he couldn't pull the trigger. He dragged himself under a fir tree and hid there. And soon the soldiers came in and they were kicking at the Jewish bodies to make sure that they were dead, discharging their weapons in case someone might have twitched. And they celebrated their great victory over this small group of partisans. But the partisans had their small victory as well. They were instructed that in a case like this, where it looked like they wouldn't survive, once their weapons were empty and there was no more ammunition, that they should take out a piece of that weapon and throw it away, so that if the soldiers, the enemy, collected them, they wouldn't be usable. Eventually, the soldiers left the area. Dad dragged himself out from under that tree. And suddenly, one of his men who had climbed up a tree and hidden there came down. He heard my father moaning. He picked him up, carried him on his back to that farm. And the farmer lent them a wagon and a horse. And the partisan took Dad back into the forest. To me, one of my father's greatest accomplishments was to resist the urge to become angry, bitter, or vengeful. And part of this, I believe, was due to the fact that there were people who exhibited humanity during his experiences. One of them was Manya, who could certainly have been killed for supplying Dad with weapons. And the same for the Polish farmer who gave them shelter for that night. But the story that stands out in my mind is one that my father would tell about a German army officer whom he called one of the finest people he'd ever met, and whom he credited with saving his life on multiple occasions. He also credited him with restoring his belief in humanity. The first time he encountered the Sonderführer had to do with a cow. Dad's sister Leah was supposed to be watching the cow as it grazed in a field near their home, and she fell asleep. And as cows are prone to do, this one wandered off to a neighboring field that was controlled by the Germans. And as my father put it, the Germans arrested that cow. Leah came home in tears, and the family was distraught because that cow was important to their nutrition, milk products, milk. And Dad, who was 17 at this time, decided he was going to go into the town and see if he could get the cow back. Of course, they all tried to dissuade him because they knew this could end very badly for him. But even at the age of 17, when my dad made up his mind was made up. He walked into town and got into line with several other Polish farmers. There was one Polish farmer who was translating from Polish into German, and he and Dad knew each other. They were both farmers. When it was Dad's turn, he told the interpreter the story, and luckily, Dad spoke German. And he listened while the interpreter translated to the Sonderführer. It's the officer who was in charge of agriculture in the area. And the interpreter didn't tell the story about the cow. Instead, he said Dad was one of several Jews who had stolen wood from the forest during a blizzard the previous winter. Now, the story was true, but it had nothing to do with the cow. And Dad figured if that's all the German officer heard, he was in big trouble. So he looked at the officer and he said, Kann ich mit Ihnen direkt sprechen? Can I speak with you directly? And the German officer's eyes got big and he said, Können Sie Deutsch sprechen? Can you speak German? And when Dad said, yeah, the officer indicated that Dad should proceed with his story. So he told him the story, and at the end he said, please, can we have the cow back? I will do anything you ask. We can just have the cow back. The German officer looked at him, and he nodded, and he said, yes. And he said, in exchange for the cow, Dad would have to work for the Reich for 3 days. Well, Dad thought this was the bargain of a lifetime. It almost assuredly was the bargain for his lifetime. When he went home with the cow, he was greeted as a hero. On the 3rd day, Dad was working with a group of Belarusian farmers. The Sonderführer came out in the morning to see how the work was going. And Dad speculated he wanted to see how a Jewish farmer worked. You probably heard they were parasites, they were weak, they were lazy. Well, he found that my father was working faster and harder than any of the Belarusian farmers. And he caught his eye and he nodded at him. Later, at the end of the workday, the officer came back and he brought with him 2 green cigars, a large lump of sugar, and half a loaf of bread. And he handed them to my dad. And he said to him, Du bist ein guter Landsarbeiter. You are a good farmer. And then he added, Schade, shame. And Dad knew that the officer was indicating that it was a shame that because he was Jewish, he was likely to be killed. But not on that day and not under that German officer's watch. Fast forward to 2003, and our family has gathered at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. for their 10th anniversary. And there was a picture that I asked someone to take of the family, which included my father, certainly, and you'll see the picture shortly, my brother and his family, our family, my stepsister and her family, and his older cousin Shirley's older son and his family. And I had that picture framed and gave it to my father. And he put it on a table in his living room in Salisbury, Maryland. And every morning he would look at that picture and he would think, Hitler, you bastard, you lost and I won. Earlier this week, I had a discussion with some of my 2G friends, other children of survivors, and they asked whether what my father said to himself was different from how I characterized him as not being angry or vengeful. And after a while, we decided that, nope, his reaction was one of rejoicing. At my father's funeral, the rabbi said, Litman taught us what it means to survive. To survive is to live with courage, faith, and hope. And for my father, most certainly, he said it meant to live with laughter and with love. Thank you.
Jennifer, can we have the slides, please? So let's move. Okay, Dena, this is your pa. And next one. And this is the family photo that Dena mentioned in her story. Beautiful photo, beautiful family. So we're going to stay in that same kind of geographical area, and we're going to have very short words about the Jewish Lithuanian partisans. So we have two main groups, one from Vilna, one from Kovno. The longer photo is from Kovno. The second photo is from Vilna. The unique thing about these two partisan groups is that both of them decided to leave their respective ghettos and go out and fight in the forests. So again, we see Jewish resistance and we see groups that unite together. The unique thing about the Vilna group is that actually the same also happens in Kovno. So the unique thing about the Lithuanian Jewish partisans is that whilst we see in many different places that Jewish partisan groups are related usually to youth movements or political movements, in both Vilna and Kovno, what we see is the unification between all the movements together to create a united front. In Vilna, for instance, they even call themselves the United Partisan Movement, the FPO. So yes, let's move one more slide.
So now we have Lynne, who is not only our scholar and lecturer, but she is also our next storyteller. We do know that we are running a bit late, so we hope if you can that you will stay for Lynne's story and Karen Weber's poem. And we thank you so much for staying with us as long as you can. We recognize everybody has their schedule. So here we go about Lynne. You already know about Lynne and her role at Teach the Shoah. Now let's tell you about Rozka Korczak. Rozka was born in 1921 in Poland and joined the movement upon the outbreak of World War II. She was active in HaShomer HaTzair and took leadership in the United Partisan Organization, smuggling weapons into the Vilna ghetto and helping Jews escape. She was among the last of the fighters to leave the ghetto in September 1943, carrying the movement's archives on her back. Lynne, we will spotlight you now. And when you are ready, we are ready.
Thank you. Lisa is calling. Lisa is calling. This is the code. It was given by the underground commanders. Jews, defend yourself with weapons. The Germans and the Lithuanians are coming to the ghetto. Soon we will be taken away. Through that gate, we will be taken like we were taken on Yom Kippur, like we were taken on the night of the yellow passes and the pink and the white sheens. This is how our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and children, this is how we were led. This is how thousands were taken to die. But we will not go. We will not expose our necks like lambs. Jews, defend yourself with weapons. Do not believe the false promises of the murderers, the words of the traitors. Whoever leaves the ghetto gate will be taken only to Punari. And Punari is death. This message was plastered on the ghetto walls. 1st of September, 1943, 5 a.m., the ghetto is surrounded. Lisa is calling. At 5:30, all the FPO fighters, all of the Joint Underground members are standing guard in their stations. The headquarters on Strashan number 6, this is where we will carry out our plan. This is where we start our armed resistance. At 8 in the morning, also the unlisted teens are joining us. We're building barricades on Strachan Street. I leave the group, under the noses of the police, heading to the hiding place. I want to get more arms. I put on a very large coat, and I get to the hiding place, and I get it from under the ground. Take the grenades, the ammunitions, the bullets. Askia, my friend, she's running over. The Germans are in the yard. She's screaming, run. The two of us, we smuggle out of this hiding place. I'm clutching my gun in my coat. I made it back to my spot on Strachan Street. Ilya Shinbov, he's the commander of this station that we're standing in. He gives us the last command. Fires the first shot. We all join in. The Germans fire back. Ilya gets shot. The Germans pull back. We got word that the building behind us is about to be blown up by the Germans. So we moved to a different location. Within minutes, the earth starts moving from the explosion of that building. And we're waiting. And waiting. The Germans leave the ghetto, taking their wounded and their dead. Jews from the ghetto volunteer to go, to be taken to Estonia. They don't want to stay in the ghetto. They don't want to be caught in the crossfire. The command of the FBO, the Joined Underground Movement, has a meeting a few days later. It's been decided that all of the underground fighters will be going to the forest. We'll fight there. 10th of September. We agreed to be the last group to leave. Most of the fighters, they've already started making their way to Rudnicki Forest. Whoever is left is gathered at Strachan Street. We, all of our weapons with us, we will be leaving in an hour. We're underground, 150 of us, are underground in this strange and wondrous world of the sewers. Long line of people, messages moving down the chain of people. 6 minutes ago, we left the ghetto gates, but underground. Don't stall. We're all wet, filthy, sweaty. Weapons against our body make us so hot. Outside, it's already dark. We emerge one after the other. We're meeting our friends outside, making our way to the bridge. We wait at the bridge for the last of our people to come. We're also waiting for the order forward. In front of us is the bridge. Behind us, the last houses of Vilna can be seen in the distance. The last night in the forest, Rudnicki Forest. We've been here for months. We were told that in the morning, we are to assemble, take only the clothes that we are wearing and our weapons. We are going to battle. The Soviet army is already close. People had such mixed feelings. Some were so happy, some were sad, some were upset, some were silent. We went into our Zemlankas to think. Someone in a different Zemlanka right next to us screamed, "Liberty! What am I to do with you? I spit on it." Our group was different to the other partisan groups. We, the Jews, in our unit, we knew what we may be going back to, if we make it back. In the morning, the three of us, Abba, Vitka, myself, without planning in advance, stepped out of the camp. I don't know what made us do it. We just felt like we had to go out, maybe to think. And just like in the ghetto, the three of us, we never saw ourselves as individuals. We were always part of a group. So we stepped out together as a group. We were trying to think what we're going to do. Abba thought, we need to fight. Take revenge. That's the only important thing. Vitka and I, maybe because we're women, we were a bit more realistic. We said, we don't have many people left. We should go try and find all of our people, all of our Jewish people. And together, we should unite. You see, we don't know how many people are left, because when we left the ghetto, we knew there was an uprising in Warsaw, and we knew there was also one in Białystok, but we didn't know who was left, if anyone was left. The most important thing is we need to find whoever is still alive, and together, make our way to Israel. That's the only thing we could do. After all that was decided, we went back to the partisan group, and we were ready to go into battle. There were 5 days of battle, but I won't explain or go into the details. But at the end of those 5 days, we were told that Vilna was finally liberated. The full brigade of Lithuanian partisans, and us, the Jews, we could all now go back to the city because the Red Army had liberated Vilna. So we went, us, the Jewish partisans, marching together with the others. But we could see people standing at the doorsteps and looking at us. Some said, look how many of them are left. The following day, after we already settled in this house that they gave us because we were partisans, I wanted to go into the center of the town. So I walked, and a woman was walking in front of me with a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. And suddenly I hear the woman speaking in Yiddish. This is the first time that I've seen a Jewish child. After all this time that I thought I may never see a Jewish child alive again. And after all those months in the woods and the years in the ghetto, I stood in the middle of the street and burst out crying.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. And could we have the slides up, please? So this might be one of the most famous partisan photos to date. And this is the survivors of the FBO, go back one, sorry. The surviving members of the FBO, which is the United Partisan Organization. In the circles, we have the young dashing gentleman Abba Kovner, and we have Vitka Kempner, then to become Vitka Kovner. And next to Abba, we have Rozka, who might have not been a very tall lady, but she was a very fierce one. This photo was taken in Vilna about 2 days after Vitka heard this child speaking in Yiddish. All right, let's move on.
Thank you, Lynn. So we're going to conclude with a poem by Cantor entitled Eyes as Blue as the Aegean, about Greek women partisans, which she wrote specifically for this program. Karen?
Set it up, to set it up, think of the colors of Greece, the blues and browns and whites and green. And the name of the Greek resistance was called Antartiko from 1941 to 1945. Eyes as blue as the Aegean, wide Nazi fishing nets catch many minnows, villages and towns empty of every fish that doesn't swim away fast enough. Meanwhile, on land, grandparents forced into cattle cars bound for Treblinka, while we, brightly colored damselfish, swim into the arms of waiting mountains from the city, from the country. We privileged, we peasants, we become revolutionaries, smugglers, lobbers of Molotov cocktails, just girls becoming women. Like Matilda, carrying a wounded man on her back for hours. Antartiko, join us. Like Dora, known as Tarzan to her unit. Antartiko, join us. Like Captain Sarika, who handpicks 13 teen warriors who giggle when they first see the pistol, but stop when they have to shoot it, who sleep on the ground, who travel with male partisans and learn to talk to them. Antartiko, join us.
And thank you, Karen, for that beautiful poem.
Thank you, Lynn, for the beautiful reading of it.
Thank you. All right, this is actually the end of this section, and usually we open our floor now for a Q&A, but we are very conscious of the time. It is already past. So if anybody needs to leave, thank you so much for joining us. But if you're willing to stay, we are going to carry on. It is important to give credit. So all photos in this presentation were taken from the Yad Vashem Archive, the US HMM, and the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation. I will first start with the thank yous, because again, if anybody leaves, then I don't want us to miss this opportunity. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for doing all our tech and doing all our introductions. Thank you so much to Joanne and to Dena for your beautiful, beautiful storytelling. And thank you all for joining us this evening, for listening, for being present, and for being with us. And if you have
Thank you.
good day, good night, depending on when you are in the world, when and where you are in the world.
Anyway. Thank you. We totally understand, but we do want to give the opportunity to ask some questions. And if time allows, we will also be able to hear from Joanne and Dena a little bit about their story. But first, we want to start with you all as the listeners and participants. You've been taking in a lot, and we want to give you the opportunity to ask Lynn, our scholar and storyteller, and our other storytellers any questions. You can either, I can see, you can raise your hand since we are a small enough group that I'll be able to see everybody if you want to raise your hand, or you can write in the chat. So you can use that little yellow hand under reactions if you want, or just put up your physical hand. And you know what, as I'm waiting for you, if you do have questions, I just want to ask Lynn something. Lynn, you talk about the partisans, and in some cases, I believe you said in Yugoslavia, there was more of an integration between the Jewish and non-Jewish partisans, but this was not at all the reality in almost anywhere else. Am I correct on that? And can you explain any thoughts on why
Sure.
this
Yeah.
difference?
So there is integration of Jews in partisan units all over occupied Europe. But let's just take this last group that we were talking about, the FPO from Vilna. So as Rozka tells us, and Rozka should know because she kept the archive on her back, leaving the ghetto and also during the war, during the partisan time, they come out quite a lot of people from the ghetto, quite a lot of fighters, but they get split up into different units. They're integrated into different units. And these are the communist red, I say Red Army, but it's not completely Red Army, but also within the Lithuanian partisan groups. So within like the bigger partisan movement in Lithuania, we see that Jews in small clusters or small groups are integrated into the larger thing. If we look at the Bielskis in Novogrodic or the Zorin, they have their own Jewish unit, right? Which works in collaboration with the non-Jewish partisans, but they're not fully integrated or immersed into the larger group. It really depends on where and where. Yugoslavia is a unique case in general because they really act like an army. And to have 250,000 people fighting in all sorts of different places within Yugoslavia, I mean, they spread, they're not just in a small forest, it should be a program on its own. There's so much we could say about this. We can even talk about how the parachuters from the Yeshuv, from the Jewish settlement in Israel, come out and parachute into Yugoslavia, and the whole story of Hamasanish and so on. And they work together in conjunction with the partisans, as they're called in Yugoslavia. So yeah, so that could be its own 2-hour lecture.
Absolutely. Well,
Sure.
thank you for explaining that. Do
Sure.
we have any questions from the people who are listening? It can be for Lynne, Joanne, or Dena, or all three. It can be specific. It can also be a comment if you have something you appreciated that has an appreciation and a question. Again, if you can stay for a few minutes, we're here to listen. Okay, well, in the meanwhile, until we get a question, we can change routes if we do. Lynne, why don't I invite our storytellers on? Should we have Joanne first for a moment?
Yes.
And so Joanne, as our first teller, let me bring you into the spotlight with us. There you are. All right, so Joanne, do you have anything you want to say? You have known Manya and these other amazing women, and you have got to meet them and interview them extensively. Anything you want to tell us that you didn't get to put in your story?
Oh, wow.
Like probably 100 things, right?
It's just what an incredible honor it has been to know these women, to be close with them. What an honor that they trusted me with their stories. And now they're gone, and I am carrying out their legacy. And hopefully anyone who listens will be engaged and caring enough to then become their own witness to these stories and carry them on. And to that end, it sounds like a commercial, but I welcome the opportunity to do in-person and Zoom presentations to groups and schools and, all the usual book clubs and so forth. I try to, because my work is directly from their spoken mouth rather than from a written transcript or a word, there's a lot of personal dynamics going on as they tell me. And so, whereas, for instance, in Manya's testimony to the Shoah Foundation, it's pretty straightforward, declarative sentences. But in her telling her story to me, we're two friends having coffee, and it was like, oh, they had their guns pointed right at me. And I try to capture what can't be captured in a transcript. I'm so grateful to you all for listening and for caring. Thank you.
Well, Joanne, you certainly do that. I mean, you can feel like there's this combination of Joanne and your talents as a speaker and a storyteller and the personality of the woman. And you can just feel that fusion of that as you speak. So thank you so much. So I think what we'll do is we're going to switch you with Dena and spotlight her. So let me, and if there's time at the end and someone has a question for you, we can, yes. All right. So I'm going to, oh, there you go. Thanks, Lynn. Okay, Dena, so it's your turn. Anything that you want to share with us? This has been a journey. You're so involved. I just want to let everyone know with the Gen After community in the Washington, D.C. area. You're a leader long before in the Holocaust remembrance community, long before you met us at Teach the Shoah. Anything you want to share about how the storytelling has contributed to your work? We're open to hearing from you.
Well, I got started sharing my story by doing it in writing because that's what my background is. And there's a difference between writing it and reading it and writing it and telling it. And I credit Teach the Shoah for helping me learn how better to tell the story. I'm fortunate in that my father, when I was 25 years old, I took a tape recorder. We were living upstate New York. He's in Salisbury, Maryland. And I started taping my father's story. Well, with my father, you got him started and he'd go. But we have hours of tapes of him, and my brother, God bless him, transcribed it. So when I want to check something, I just go to my book and I can check it. And we also have an even thicker book of letters to the editor that he wrote about his experiences about living in America, about Israel. And I find details in some of the interviews that are published that weren't in his recording. So I meet many 2Gs, children of survivors, who don't have the benefit of that. And so I'm extremely grateful that I do, and that I have the opportunity through Teach the Shoah, through our own Gen After Speakers Bureau. And I see my co-chair, Jeannie Glucksman, here, to share these stories.
Fantastic, Dena, and thank you for bringing the writing skills and also the being willing, this whole new like art form with the storytelling, which you have just done so beautifully. So thank you for both and for spreading it in these different modalities, because we're reaching more and more people the different ways we do this. We have a question from Stephanie, so it is in the chat, but I'll read it aloud for the folks who it's hard to read on their computer or phone. Dena, I have met, Stephanie says, I have met Bella Rubin, who is a member of the Bielski family. She once said, "We are very proud of our family's history. We live it every day. It is in our DNA, excuse me, and that of our children." That's the quote. The Bielskis came to Germany, Stephanie's writing, after the war and spent some time in a DP, a displaced persons camp. I am involved in a place of remembrance on the site of this former displaced persons camp. And we also tell the story of the Bielski brothers. Do you know if your father's cousin spent some time at the DP camp with the Bielskis? And Stephanie,
I have no personal knowle of him
is
doing
near
so.
Munich, just to let you know, and he's been one of our storytellers before. She's
Sorry,
Stephanie. Dena, continue.
Cousin Jerry actually immigrated to Canada after the war, but I don't know precisely when he did. However, I am in touch with his two children, and I will ask them that question.
That is great. And we can put you two in touch afterward. That would be wonderful. So great. Thank you, Stephanie, for your knowledge and for your question. Do we have any other? I think we are going to have to wrap up quite soon.
Sonia is
Lynn, did
raising
you-
her hand, her digital hand, her non-digital hand, but you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you to everybody for making this a very memorable evening. I learned a lot about the partisans. I could have listened to more stories. And I want to say that what occurred to me is that these partisans are the true superheroes of
Yep.
the Jewish people, not what you see on the Hollywood screens, but they're the true superheroes. And to follow up on what Dena said about her question to her father about God, true, our God is a difficult God and he demands a lot of us, but without him, where would we be?
That is true.
Yeah, so we must continue our fight, unfortunately, for survival. And please God, he will protect us. And we will continue to produce superheroes. But thank you to the storytellers. You did a great job. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, from your mouth to God's ears. Yes, may we continue having superheroes being birthed to us. And may we have, if not superheroes, I think quite human, beautiful heroes here telling these stories, taking on this tremendous work and responsibility as Lynne, Dena, Joanne have, and as Karen does with her beautiful poetry, bringing us just a different way of seeing these stories than reading in a book or hearing a lecture, though those are wonderful things as well. We're so happy to bring you stories and lectures, and thank you for being here with us tonight. Lynne,
Thank
anything
you.
else? Should I put up my final slide here? Just the
Yeah.
goodbye. I think it's just the end.
Sure.
Yes, this is
Well.
just telling you, stay in touch with us. We want
Stay
to
in
keep
touch.
seeing you. We have courses. We will have more in the fall. There will be 6-week beginner courses in the fall or the winter where you'll get to learn how to tell a story if you want to do what these incredible women did by researching a story maybe that you don't know or telling your own family story. We are here to help you do that, and we take you through a process. You actually can do this.
So follow us
thank
on
you.
Facebook, and that would be the best place to get all your upcoming events and courses and programs and lectures and end. And thank you.
And I want to say one last thing, Lynne, that even though these programs are absolutely free, and we're so happy to offer these as we call one-off programs for free, it does always help to have your support. So we do have a link here, which we can put in the chat, teachtheshoah.org/donate, if you are so inclined. And we will say
much,
thank you.
everybody. And we wish you all a good night. Storytellers, or Dena at least. Actually, whoever wants. I'm going to stay on for a bit for some schmoozing. I know Jennifer needs to go.
Yeah.
But thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Stay for a bit. I'm here.